credit rating agencies. First, colleague Nikolaos CHOUNTIS.
Thank you, President. Today's discussion in the European Parliament has to do with the activities and repercussions that credit rating agencies have on the economy of Europe and the global economy. The European Union and the Central Bank have issued with their various regulations to the Moody's, S&P and Fitch credit rating agencies the right to assess not only companies but the member states of the European Union themselves, and this is absolutely unheard of from both a political and economic point of view. When the crisis broke out, the institutions of the European Union themselves recognized this very negative role of CRAs. So one would expect the European Commission to reduce and limit the role of these CRAs with the new Regulation 1060. Back in 2009, in fact, these CRAs had begun to downgrade Greece's credit ratings, and the result was that they had to pay twice as much in interest rates than before. And of course, this led to a vicious cycle of downgrading and a lot of speculative lending, and the ultimate result we all know. And yesterday, President, Moody's tried once again to create a negative climate for the Greek economy and the euro itself. And there was no reason for this, but they actually downgraded the Greek economy by 4 points. So Moody's is one of the 3 American private agencies which the European Union officially recognizes as credit rating agencies for the economies of our member states, in spite of the fact that everybody has condemned this in Europe and America for the huge responsibility and liability with regard to the recent crisis. More specifically, this is a company which was condemned by former analysts in the American Congress because they were forced by their bosses to carry out positive ratings of toxic bonds. And we have this holy trinity of speculators with Moody's, S&P's and Fitch, and the disastrous consequences in the United States of America. This is a company where millions of dollars have been lost. They have led to this subprime crisis, and even in the state of Ohio alone, $450 million were lost. Now, we know all of this, President, ladies and gentlemen, but it isn't possible to have American private and interested companies making assessments and ratings of European economies. This should be done by a public, democratically elected body, which has nothing to do with private interests. But even today, ladies and gentlemen, what we're hearing from the Commission is that the whole procedure is being stymied, and the result is that this mafia of speculators is continuing to carry out extortion and lead the economic policy into a path which is to the detriment of the workers and the citizens of the EU. The European Parliament finally has to take on its responsibilities to intervene and call upon the European Commission and the Council to take into account what the European Parliament is saying and to create legislation immediately to put an end to this unspeakable and unacceptable situation.
Mr. Gianni PITTELLA. Thank you very much, President, Commissioner, colleagues. With this oral question, the Socialist and Democratic Group would like to draw the House's attention to problems relating to rating agencies. And the idea is to find out from the Commission what the next moves will be as the advisedness which we support of creating a European rating agency. We think this is something that would be opportune, especially, and in fact this seems to be taking shape given what President Barroso himself has said. I think we have to acknowledge that the credit rating agencies have succeeded in a practically impossible mission. They have been decisive protagonists both in the first phases of the financial crisis in 2008 after the the collapse of Lehman Brothers, but also they've been protagonists in the second stage with the crisis in public funds in Greece. In 2008, in some cases, they actually promoted the risks linked to toxic products, and now they want to make their contribution to stabilising markets by actually cutting the credit rates of Greece, Spain and Portugal, while negotiations were underway between the European Union, the IMF and the ECB, and this seemed that their influence was rather harming, rather damaging. Now, I don't want to blame the credit rating agencies for everything that's going wrong in Europe, but they seem to always be the main players on the legal field. They were involved in the Parmalat case, they were involved in the Enron case, they were involved in the Lehman Brothers collapse. So there were players everywhere, and so I think that would call upon us to move. We must get beyond our static approach at the moment. So, Commissioner, when are we going to have an inquiry into this sector? When are we going to look into them? Mr. GAUZÈS has been looking into this. We looked into it with him a while ago when we adopted a report on the CRAs, but now we need a sectoral inquiry in order to investigate the unacceptable, scandalous situation of this oligopolistic situation that has been created in this sector. Let's get to grip with this matter before things get even worse. Let's move from words to deeds. Apart from the need to create a European credit rating agency, we also need to reflect about the role to be played by courts of auditors, independent courts of auditors, in giving an assessment of sovereign debt and basically preventing the private companies from having a role here. Mr. Sarkozy and Mrs. Merkel have asked the European Union to come up with proposals to strengthen competition on the market of credit rating agencies. Now, it's a pity that in the Council, in the European Council, where Sarkozy and Merkel sit together, it's a pity that it's the governments in particular who are actually slowing down the approval of the financial supervisory packet, actually slowing up the setting up of ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Authority that will be responsible for financial supervision. So, Mrs. Merkel, Mr. Barroso, Mr. Merkel and Mr. Sarkozy, instead of writing to Mr. Barroso, you should write to yourselves.
Welcome, Mr. Commissioner Barnier, being with us from the beginning of our discussion. Thank you very much for coming. It will be your turn a few minutes later, but welcome to you. And now the next speaker is Jean-Paul Gauzès.
Merci.
Paldies, priekšsēdētāja kungs, komisāra kungs, dārgie kolēģi.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, the last Parliament took an interest in credit rating agencies. Both the Commission and Parliament adopted a regulation on credit rating agencies. And here they are, back on the agenda again, because a number of observations have been made about their role in the crisis. Why didn't the credit rating agencies see the crisis coming? Why did ratings go up and down? Why did they fluctuate so widely? And why did we see what we saw in the case of sovereign debt? Credit rating agencies give ratings to investment products. That's fair enough. People who invest money have a right to know the degree of risk underlying their investment. Where things become less clear is when ratings determine the capital requirements of banks in proportion to their investments. The 2009 regulation doesn't really give us any answers as far as the authorization of credit rating agencies is concerned. So ratings, yes, but the manner in which ratings are published, not so sure. I understand, Commissioner, You have just submitted a document which forms part of the financial supervision architecture of the future on credit rating agencies. And there is an issue that has to be tackled in terms of competition between credit rating agencies. I don't think a European credit rating agency, even a public one, is going to be the answer to the problem. A more generous, a kinder, gentler credit rating agency wouldn't help us in the least. It's the way the ratings are published that is a problem. There are two sorts: the ratings given to businesses and those to sovereign debt. On sovereign debt, I would say the following. We have a new market supervision authority for Europe, and that authority should be able not just effectively to supervise the rating agencies, but should also put in place a mechanism to control the way in which credit rating agencies publish ratings on sovereign debt. You can't have a country being downgraded by a credit rating agency 15 minutes before the close of business on the trading floor. So you need preemptive measures enabling the credit rating agencies to work, but under certain limitations in terms of the time at which they publish their ratings. And the way and sovereign debt should not be should not see its rating changed in a way that would jeopardize its value. There you are, Commissioner. Those are the lines along which we are thinking. We're looking at ways of making the credit rating agencies work better, improving competition, but also controlling the way they publish their ratings. Thank you.
Monsieur GAUZÈS. Our next speaker is Madame Goulard, and you also have 4 minutes, Madame.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Good afternoon, Commissioner, colleagues. You come from a country where ratings tend to cause quite a stir. It's usually the Michelin guide, but I'm not saying that we're against a rating, because it does allow for a certain amount of emulation to reward good performance. So, as Mr. GAUZÈS said, we're not trying to point a finger at the body doing the rating. We're trying to control and supervise the way in which they operate. These are, of course, institutions which have considerable powers, which is why we have to look very closely at the way in which they're working. Jean-Paul GAUZÈS has just said what I wanted to say, and that is there is a distinction between private companies, rating agencies, and those in charge of sovereign debt. But there is a similarity. Are we talking about the right type of methodology? Are we using the right criteria to assess what a company is doing, or a government with its debt? Is there enough transparency with regard to the links that may exist between the company being rated and assessed and the personal body doing the rating? And this has to be looked into very closely. I'd like to thank you for taking on board what the Parliament said in the last Parliament with regard to the Jean-Paul GAUZÈS report. What I also would like to say is that it is important that we take a look at what has already been done here in this Parliament. I think the idea of a European credit rating agency isn't necessarily our first priority at the moment, but we have to ensure that supervision and monitoring as it is carried out today should be done in a methodological manner. Now, this question of an authority or which is to come into being soon, I'm rapporteur on the financial supervision package, together with the ESMA rapporteur, who is here, and I'd like to appeal to the member states. The presidency in office isn't here, but I do know that you can, Commissioner, convey messages to them, and I know you're working hard to bring this forward. I think member states have to take things seriously. We can't make sweeping statements in the media. with a certain amount of emotion, justifiably so, in view of the situation. And then when we talk about setting up the ESMA authority to try and put obstacles in the way. We really do want this authority to be given strong powers at European level, and we'd like it to be in a position to control and monitor these credit rating agencies. They'll have other jobs to do as well. We'd like to see supervision by a European authority of market infrastructures, for example, compensation chambers and so on. There's a lack of transparency on the market, and we are very concerned. We don't have a problem. We're not hostile to competition. On the contrary, we are not against competition, but the way in which these ratings are issued must comply with transparency regulations, which are features on markets that deserve to be called markets. So we're calling on member states not to put obstacles in the way of the creation of ESMA, and not to remove the supervision package of its contents, because with one veto after another we may end up not being able at all to monitor and control what we want, and that is to have closer supervision of capital. Thank you.
See, Madame Goulard. Now we will hear the view of the Commission. Commissioner Barnier, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ladies and gentlemen, honourable members, I'd like first of all to thank most warmly the political groups for taking the initiative to raise these questions. Mr. Chountis, Mr. Pittella, Mr. GAUZÈS and Madame Goulard and other members who will be speaking on this very important set of issues. You will soon realize how resolute I am when it comes to this issue, as on so many others. The citizens of Europe and the businesses of Europe have a right to transparency. On the 20th of April, I had the pleasure of addressing you on the subject of credit rating agencies and their importance from the point of view of the functioning of the economy and financial markets. Sometimes a product, a business, or indeed a state needs to have its temperature taken. And if a product, a business, or a state is unwell, then breaking the thermometer in half isn't going to make it better. The thermometer needs to be accurate in its measurement. And sometimes you need more than one thermometer to measure accurately. And there are different ways of measuring the sound functioning of a product or business or sovereign debt. And the credit rating agencies have different ways of measuring. The crisis has shown that the credit rating agencies have not always worked in the best possible way, sometimes with unfortunate consequences. The G20 took robust decisions on this and other issues, putting in place supervisory and governance rules. I would remind you that at the time of the crisis, many of you, Mr. GAUZÈS, Madame Goulard, noted that the Commission responded immediately, and the Commission immediately took up the issue of credit rating agencies. September 2009, a year after the failure of Lehman Brothers, the regulation on credit rating agencies was adopted with great help from the European Parliament. Thank you, Mr. GAUZÈS, in parentheses. The purpose of all of that was to improve to the sound functioning of credit rating agencies which had previously contributed to the crisis. Now all agencies have a registration requirement and have to meet a number of strict demands in order to prevent as far as possible any conflict of interest, to improve the quality of ratings, the methodology of credit ratings, and to ensure that CRAs act in a more transparent manner. Honourable members, I believe that these new rules will significantly improve the independence and the integrity and the transparency of the credit rating process and the quality of the work of credit rating agencies. including when it comes to the sovereign debt of EU member states and EU financial institutions. 2 weeks ago came the second stage. On the 2nd of June, at my instigation, the Commission adopted a proposal for an amendment to the regulation on credit rating agencies to give ESMA, the future European Securities and Markets Authority, exclusive competence when it comes to registration and continuing supervision of credit rating agencies. I certainly agree with Madame Goulard and others that this is something we need. We'll be talking with the rapporteur on the Larosière supervisory package. We need to reach a compromise, a dynamic compromise between Parliament and Council in order to implement what has been proposed. That is the 3 independent authorities which are to start work on the 1st of January next year. We're not there yet. There's a whole lot that still needs to be done, and I would appeal from this place to Council and Parliament to do your bit, and the Commission will certainly try to foster that dynamic compromise. As I said, the aim is to increase transparency and improve competition between credit rating agencies, and so there is now a mechanism for access to information on structured financial instruments to all credit rating agencies interested in granting credit ratings. Other agencies will be granted access to information given to anyone. In Europe, as elsewhere in the world, it is recognized that the crisis has shone the light of day on certain shortcomings in the work of the credit rating agencies, and we haven't yet found all the answers, as Mr. Chountis was saying. That's why I've asked my services to look at the architecture of the agencies, their work, to analyze in a precise and objective way exactly how these agencies work in the light of the new regulatory architecture, even though it hasn't yet been fully implemented. I think that you will agree, ladies and gentlemen, that the market is concentrated. There isn't competition. There are too few players, and that worries me. For the time being, Mr. Pittella, the Commission is looking at structural measures, including the notion of an independent European credit rating agency, which, as far as I personally am concerned, I'm in favor of, especially when it comes to rating sovereign debt. Mr. GAUZÈS, Madame Goulard, Mr. Pittella. We're also looking at a greater role for independent public entities. Sovereign debt, because that's what the Greek case is all about, sovereign debt requires special attention so that we can be sure that the methods used are the right ones and the appropriate ones. A lack of proper diligence on the part of the banks and other financial institutions, a lack of alternatives when it comes to assessing the quality of an investment product is and remains a problem and requires deeper consideration. We shan't dodge any of the difficult questions. The Commission is working on all of them, and you'll hear from us in September. At the same time, we're dealing with other issues to do with transparency and control of derivatives and short selling. You can expect legislative proposals by the end of this year or the latest the beginning of 2011. Madame Goulard, this is not just so that we can pick up the baton from our predecessors and continue their work, but it's also to take several leaps forward in favor of transparency to reduce conflict of interest, to diversify the market. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Now we will hear the speakers for our political group. We will start with the Socialists and Democrats, and Mr. Sánchez Presedo has 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. Commissioner Barnier, the credit rating agencies weren't able to foresee the subprime crisis and the crisis with structured financial instruments and their role in the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And the legislation of 2009 promotes greater transparency and ensures that there will be scrutiny of the CRAs, and we were looking at their liability and the quality of their work. But there are some conflict of interest that we look into in their area of operations. The new proposal from the Commission follows on in this direction, and we in the Parliament are going to make a contribution as well, so that there will be supervision as of the 1st of January 2011, and also we're going to be cooperating in all these projects, so there will be a new and stricter regulatory framework. The role being played by the debt crisis and sovereign debt at the moment, and the role of the credit rating agencies there, makes it clear that they are rather discretionary when it comes to their rating. That they have different methods and they have different approaches to communication, and also they have their ratings have a pro-cyclical effect. People have said that they actually increase the vicious circle, and they breathe on the flames, they blow on the flames and make the fire worse. But if you look at the international European setup, well, the ECB has decided to do without their ratings when it comes to sovereign debt operations. It's trying to play its role greater and compare those interests with those of general interest. At the moment, these CRAs need to be able to carry out objective and responsible assessment, in particular of sovereign debt risk. And the questions that are arising have to have a deeper approach. We had to have a structural approach, as you said, when we've looked at the compatibility of these CRAs with democratic principles, because CRAs will have an impact on the lives of pensioners and workers and on the lives of vulnerable people who will be crushed by the way in which the markets function. Also, we've got to look at the independency of the CRAs. Is it compatible to have a private company assessing public firms and state economies? And isn't there a conflict of interest here? These are the players who seem to be judge and jury. With the issues we need to look into. It's about time that we looked at them. There's the issues here relating to responsibility and sustainability. We need to avoid short-termism. We need to promote instead sustainability. We can't be indifferent to the commitments entered into by the European authorities and by the efforts of the big international players here. We need to look at the effects of everything that we do on the market, and also we have to look at the pernicious effects of some of these rating decisions. We want to make sure there is regulatory independence when we actually use these ratings from the CRAs. At the moment, there's still a lack of competition and the lack of credibility for these rating agencies. But nonetheless, they do have huge impact on economies, but there's nobody controlling them. There's no scrutiny of what they're doing. So what we need is to improve the economic governance structure and the business structure. Perhaps we could even have a European public credit rating agency to give a new role to existing European agencies, and we could also raise the need for global rating agency in line with all these principles. So those are all questions that need answering, Commissioner. Thank you.
Gracias, Senor Sanchez. Our next speaker, Madame Bowles, for the Liberals and Democrats. 1.5 minutes.
Thank you. Commissioner, not so long ago, voices were raised to say that rating agencies should not have downgraded Greek and other bonds. Look at what it has done to the euro, they said. Now, I was going to say that does it need any more to be said to prove the huge conflict of interest that there would be if countries effectively rated their own debt? Then this morning, in the debate on statistics, Commissioner Rehn said yesterday's downgrade by Moody's was not conveniently timed, and that would influence Commission thinking on credit rating agency regulation. I'm sorry, I do understand frustration, but my thoughts were, have you gone mad? I do not want ratings that are convenient, whether that be convenient for investment banks or convenient for central banks. Indeed, ratings have been a bit too convenient for regulators to lean on too, driving out proper due diligence. Now, a public agency for non-sovereign assets has some attractions, but how do we get over the implied guarantee? How do we get over political interference if bank capital is at risk, with the macroeconomic consequences of that? We have some way to go in the search for capacity, independence and integrity, but of one thing I am sure, and that is that corporate governance principles play a part, be it in the public or private sector, and that should apply to ESMA and the other ESAs too. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Bowles. Unser nächster Redner ist Herr Giegold und hat 3 Minuten.
Vielen Dank, Herr
Thank you, President. And thank you, Commissioner Barnier. And also, thank you for using the German language earlier on. First of all, I'd like to say that the crisis that we have experienced once again shows us what one of the central problems is. And I think, in addition to what has been said, I'd perhaps like to emphasize a few things. And one is that the rating agencies have been working together with other agencies that aren't able to assess risks in any way. They've been, in comparison to other measurements on the market, they have reduced reliability. And the oligarchy on the markets is another problem. The number of people with offers to make on the market, this was mentioned by Mr. Barnier, there's so many players on the market, this complicates things even further. Another problem which is very complicated is incentive, and I don't think we've talked about this sufficiently so far. What exactly have we here in this situation with the rating agencies? The issuance of ratings is given, therefore, is giving a reward to a particular person in the class who gets a higher mark. It's like being in the university, and before the exam you go out and find your professor and pay them to give you a good score, to give you a good mark. And this is a problem which we really need to take into account. I know that the Commission has been thinking about how those who have a financial product to offer can actually seek out the rating agency to influence their assessment. And this brings us on to the other matter of the sovereign bonds and the question of the private sector when that is assessed. We have to put a stop to this false system of incentives. We need a public body, not a private oligopoly to be replaced by a monopoly, as very often is proposed by the left. But what we need is a public body that will ensure that other economic players are selected to produce these ratings, and that the quality is also made public and reviewed. So, Commissioner, I'm delighted with your proposals, and I do hope that they will lead us to finding a solution to the existing problems, which, thanks to the efforts of Mr. GAUZÈS and the Commission and the Council, which these problems still exist, but hopefully we will find a new solution without creating a monopoly, but by taking a look at problems of regulation and incentive in this area, and to take a consistent approach.
Now, Madame Swinburne for the European Conservatives and Reformists. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioner Barnier. It was clear very early in the financial crisis that there had been huge failings on the part of credit rating agencies. Hence, it was one of the first things addressed by the EU last year. Updating the directive to cast responsibility for the EU activities of the predominantly US-based agencies is to be welcomed as a move to monitor their activity more closely here in Europe. Credit rating agencies are extremely powerful organisations and have the ability to move the markets with a change of rating. Their independence needs therefore to be ascertained and maintained at all times. However, any rating decisions that trigger a flow of billions of euros should not come as a surprise to the market. For example, credit rating agencies should publish their ongoing stress tests and scenario analyses so as to improve market transparency and minimise shocks. However, we must remember that what it is credit rating agencies are set up to do: to assess the risk of default of an entity, be it a product or a corporation, especially a publicly listed company, including financial institutions or even sovereign states. In the same way that we should not blame credit rating agencies for responding to legitimate information on the state of our banks, we should not use them as an excuse for the market's reaction to the dire state of our public finances. Although monitoring their activity more closely is to be supported, a more critical proposal needs to be framed around a different question, namely, why have the markets, investors, corporations and sovereign states relied so heavily on credit rating agencies rather than conducting adequate due diligence and collecting information for themselves? In particular, why is the credit rating market dominated by 3 names when there are many more available to the marketplace? When we have answered these broader questions, then the way credit rating agencies are held to account will become more meaningful. With their great power and influence in the markets, there should also be significant responsibility.
Thank you very much, Madam Swinburne. Now, Mr. KLUTE, Herr KLUTE.
Ja, danke schön, Herr Vorsitzender.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd just like to remind you, yesterday Greece was again downgraded by Moody's. We all remember, we all know that in the last few weeks the Greek government has put its own population under enormous pressure in order to overcome the crisis. We know about the €750 billion package from the European Union to support countries that get into a crisis situation. Nonetheless, Greece has been downgraded, but again the same has happened to Spain after Spain has introduced austerity measures. Commissioner Barnier, you talked about not breaking the thermometer in half, but I'm not sure that the thermometer is a useful metaphor when it comes to credit rating agencies, because it seems that the thermometer is actually making the patient more sick. How can you downgrade a country which is taking these enormous measures? What are these agencies trying to achieve? Well, we've already heard they failed to spot the crisis coming. The rating agencies did nothing to prevent the crisis, to alert us to the crisis. In fact, their assessment of Lehman Brothers just before it failed was actually rather positive. In other words, the CRAs have failed. They have done no better in crisis management. According to the media, the various austerity packages are not doing any good, and countries are being further downgraded. Yes, sorry, Mr. President, I thought I had more time. I've described what the problem is. I'd just like to add one further sentence. States and businesses cannot be measured in the same way, and I don't think that window dressing is enough. I think a root and branch reform of the rating agency system is necessary. I'm sorry that I went over time. My group told me I had 3 minutes, not 2.
Mr. Bloom, for 1.5 minutes, please, Mr. Bloom. No.
Can you hear me now? Thank you very much. Sorry about that, Mr. President. Commissioner, credit rating agencies sold their souls to the devil some years ago when they started to rely on those companies whose bonds needed grading for payment. He who pays the piper calls the tune. It inevitably led to misgrading. Most credit rating agencies employ children who can barely read a balance sheet. They only change their gradings when a disaster is apparent to all. Paradoxically, it is usually the hedge funds who find out the truth behind the numbers. They exposed Enron, for example. But the truth about numbers can be unpopular, especially here, which is why we hate them. However, even the coke-sniffing youngsters at the credit agencies know Ireland, Greece, Spain, Italy, the United Kingdom and Portugal are broke. Kaput is kaput in any language. So what does this House propose? Our own credit rating agency, paid for by us, guaranteed to dance to our tune. It can stick AAA ratings to junk bonds issued by the Eurozone's failed economies. The question is, who would these fool? I suggest, with the exception of some English county councils and the BBC economics correspondents, virtually nobody. When the people of Europe realise that they have been the guinea pigs in a gigantic failed currency experiment, they will burn this place down and guillotine the lot of us, and who could blame them?
Thank you. Now, Madame Le Pen for 2 minutes.
Monsieur le Président. President, dear colleagues, Commissioner. Well, these CRAs have been a bit of a nuisance, that's clear, and they have actually enhanced pro-cyclical features of the crisis. And in fact, they've actually sort of blown on the flames and increased the problem. But the Commission's legislation from 2009 has remained a dead letter. It's the Member States that have to act on their own in an emergency way, and they've taken their usual short-termist approach. At the moment, of course, the CRAs can't work well because of conflicts of interest. And in fact, the Commission is taking its usual Soviet approach to this sort of legislation. We're completely wrong here. Mr. Barroso thinks that the CRA should be supervised by the European Central Bank and by the Commission, but that's just illusory, especially since the amazing statement by Mr. Jean-Claude Trichet in February 2010, when he said the efforts of consolidation for the bank's balance sheets requires high degrees of confidentiality. In other words, opacity and secrecy. Quite clearly, we are attacking the symptoms. We're not dealing with the roots of the problem. Is it the investors or the issuers who have to pay for the CRAs? The independence of the CRAs isn't going to solve the problem. Until we end this possibility of people being able to raise money through leverage without holding a cent themselves, as long as we carry on with that, capitalism is going to be bringing us onto the verge of collapse and have a devastating effect on our peoples and our economies. We should prevent people just printing money and levering huge loans like this, which then leads to speculation and irrational behaviour of markets. When we go back to sound finance, we won't need the CRAs.
SCICLUNA is our next speaker, and he has 2 minutes.
Mr. President, the recent attack by the European leaders on the credit rating agencies regarding the timing and degree of downgrades being meted out to countries' sovereign debts may be seen by some somewhat exaggerated. However, the failures of credit rating agencies are now well known, and I think there is general agreement from all sides of this Parliament on this. They have given high ratings to bonds which subsequently defaulted. Now that the tide has turned and the economic outlook across Europe remains bleak, they are guilty of overreacting in the opposite direction. Not even an impressive and unprecedented €750 billion package seemed to convince them. Having said that, we have to be careful when reacting to this, not to be appearing to be shooting the messenger just because he brings bad news. One thing is for sure, when they overrate, whether they overrate or underrate a financial product, the influence of the rating agencies on global financial markets is enormous. In effect, they can and do hold a country and its people, including workers and pensioners, to ransom, and this cannot but have political implications which need to be addressed. We need to understand how rating agencies create and sell their ratings. The arrangement between the security issuer and the agencies is an obvious problem. Secondly, there is the question of the number of themselves, of the agencies, and the degree of effective competition between them. If, as they must be, banks and financial institutions are to be regulated, why should rating agencies be treated any differently, especially given the oligopolistic structure of the rating agency market? The causes of the problem, including the conflicts of interest, are therefore clear. The solutions, however, appear less straightforward. So let us keep level-headed and find the right solution, being careful not to overreact with serious consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. SCICLUNA. The next Redner is Herr KLINZ für 1,5 Minuten.
Commissioner, the rating agencies in this global financial crisis and the euro difficulties have played a considerable role. Questions of transparency, conflicts of interest, extortion through fees, questionable practices speak for themselves. And the rating agencies just don't see where the problem is. I proposed that the EU should take some action, and I'm glad that you feel the same way. We need to set up a European credit rating agency on the basis of the model of foundations, and of course this has to be an independent, it has to be financially independent, it mustn't be subject to either Commission influence, ECB influence, or any other member state private financial influence. And so as a foundation, an independent foundation, this agency will be able to do something about the oligopoly, or not to say monopoly, of the three credit rating agencies. And every product offered in Europe and every company must propose two ratings, and one has to be issued by this European agency. To be independent, of course, it has to have its own financing, which means we need state funding. This could come from the European Investment Bank or perhaps the Commission, and then this foundation, this European foundation, must be able to finance itself. We have to see and clarify how that should happen as a contractor or find some sort of solution. But we need to think about whether or not use of rating agencies could be reduced. This seems to me to be a difficult problem to address at the moment.
Now, Madame Ford, 1 minute.
Thank you. I welcome the debate on rating agencies. We do need to look at the reliance on ratings and how to encourage more agencies so there's more competition, and also the issue of conflict of interest with respect to borrower-paid ratings. However, I would say that it has always been well known to every investor that this potential for conflict existed, and that credit ratings are themselves not a recommendation to buy or sell. We should also remember that to achieve our 2020 goals, the EU needs investment, and that needs market confidence, and rating agencies are a vital part of market confidence. When ratings work, they increase capital markets access for borrowers, lower interest rates, and thus for sovereign issuers save taxpayers' money. They also serve to give investors some guidance, but as I said, not buy and sell decisions. Please remember that in Europe, no AAA-rated sovereign or corporate issuer has ever defaulted. Even in this crisis, the level of AAA defaults in structured credits in Europe is less than 0.3%, i.e. 99.9% of AAAs have not defaulted. We do need this investor confidence. We do need to look at our rating agencies, but please remember that they have not got everything wrong.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Signor Morganti. Una minuta, prego.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President, honourable colleagues. I'm convinced that we need to improve the transparency and accountability of these CRAs, but I don't agree with the idea of those who want to limit the scope of action and the roles of the CRAs. The shortcomings of the CRAs, they didn't foresee risks to the market. Well, these are just echoes of the much greater failings of the public financial authorities and our entire banking system. I believe in a free market, and I think it's desirable to have complete and openness and more competition in the area of CRAs, but the creation of a European public credit rating agency would just be a risk. And it would just be actually sort of creating greater risk for public finances. Now, and I think we need to look at the responsibility of CRAs, look at their responsibility for the present financial crisis. But I think that the reasons for the crisis are economic above all, and it's a result of our policies. And many countries thought that they could actually forget about the real economy and just rely on money made in the city, money made in finances, and forgetting all about manufacturing.
Next speaker is Madame Podimata. She has 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, today's discussion on the framework for supervising credit rating agencies and the way they work is even more crucial after yesterday's decision by Moody's to downgrade by 4 units Greece's rating. Of course, it's not the first time over the last few months that Greece's rating has been downgraded considerably, but yesterday's downgrading is quite clearly provocative. It doesn't take into account any progress that has been made in implementing the recovery program and austerity measures, which members of the Troika who were in Athens praised, nor efforts made with regard to stability and the mechanism, nor the fact that 10 billion euros have been spent on trying to put new impetus into the Greek economy. Commissioner, the President of the European Central Bank and the Governor of the Deutsche Bank and the President of the Commission are congratulating the Greek government on implementing the agreement that was reached and helping to bring up the rate of the euro. At the same time, we have Moody's continuing to further downgrade Greece, which really results in the opposite assessment. And I think this is a move which highlights the conflict of interests that is there, because it doesn't just undermine the efforts made by Greece for fiscal recovery, but it is also an incentive for speculators on the market to continue working to the detriment of the Greek economy and the Eurozone as a whole. So once again, we see that this confirms that these credit rating agencies are assessing without having any control over the incentives of their assessments, and this raises serious questions of democracy and European and global responsibility and liability. I think you could mention many, many examples, but the question is, what are we going to do in order to protect the European economies from this speculation as a result of these misratings? We need to work at 2 levels. We need to have a competitive European rating agency, and secondly, we need a reliable framework within which credit rating agencies should work. We need to ensure that we have transparency and standards for ratings, for the time period for the assessment, and look at repercussions on the markets, and also an evaluation of the ratings and assessments over time with regard to accuracy and reliability. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Mr. Imbrasas. For 1 minute, please.
President, Commissioner, colleagues, at the backdrop of the crisis, credit rating agencies can be treated as entities which have contributed to the crisis. Nobody is responsible for the final result of the assessment, although the assessment, the ratings, have great impact on the general situation and on the ability to borrow. We understand that it's necessary to restore the confidence in the market, and the Commission has presented new rules on credit ratings, and the new procedure will mean better supervision, greater responsibility, but we need to analyze further this sector. It is necessary to ensure proper supervision of credit rating agencies, and they should also be penalized if they don't behave properly. Rating users also should be protected better, and we should also encourage competition in the sector of credit rating agencies. Thank you.
You know, each speaker has 1 minute only, and our first speaker is Herr Karas. Bitte, Herr Karas.
Herr Präsident.
President, what if you look at this unacceptable decision of Moody's yesterday? This shows quite clearly the domineering position and the power of these CRAs and the lack of transparency behind their decisions. Each CRA should be registered. Its activities and the basis for its decisions should be scrutinized and checked. When it comes to the independence of CRAs, well, we need to guarantee that, and that means that those who are being checked should not pay any money to the rating agencies. At the moment, there is an interlinking, there's conflicts of interest. We need to eliminate those. There shouldn't be simultaneous consultancy work and rating for a business at the same time from a CRA. So we need to expose the situation here. And in fact, we've got monopolistic domination of the market, and we need to overcome that, increase competition between the CRAs, and we need CRAs with seats in Europe. And I think that this idea of a foundation has been broached. I think a limited company, I think, will be necessary. But anyway, in the autumn, we will be working with Mr. Wolf, KLINZ, and it would be great if in the meantime the Commission could come up with some detailed proposals. Mr. KUTAS.
Domnule președinte, nu numai că activitatea agențiilor de rating a condus la criza financiară.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's the credit rating agencies that brought about the crisis and exacerbated it. The Parliament and Council regulation is seen as a response, a way of regulating the agencies. All agencies based in the EU must respect certain rules, and we have to make sure conflict of interest is avoided and transparency is increased. Above all, we cannot tolerate this oligopolistic situation any longer. It is quite simply wrong for the market to be influenced by 3 big US credit rating agencies. After all, the rating agencies shouldn't sink an already sunken business.
Commissioner, we know it's absurd for 1 British and 2 American private companies to be deciding over the bankruptcy of European banks and governments. This is an explosive situation, and we take a look at the time at which these agencies are taking their action for downgrading. Now, if we put this into perspective and think that the AAA stamp was given to the American economy, and we've seen the disastrous consequences of this. The quality of ratings is also dubious. with the international financial crisis, we've seen the collapse of banks, and it's high time that rules be introduced and increased supervision be introduced, not only at EU level. Thank you.
Madame Băsescu has the floor now.
Domnule președinte,
Thank you, President. In the context of the present crisis, the activity of CRAs is criticised more and more, and this is due to the fact that they were unable to give an objective rating when it came to loans contracted by companies and states. These CRAs were not able to give early warnings of a crisis, and in fact all they've done is actually worsen the credit rating of certain companies in certain states that are already in a parlous situation. There's a lack of competition when it comes to the CRAs. There's only 3 American CRAs that are scrutinising the entire market. I support Mr. Barnier's idea of creating a European credit rating agency. As you know, last week one of the 3 agencies changed the credit rating for Germany after an unacceptable error. By way of conclusion, the European Union must ensure that in the future, that the future of the CRAs is better regulated. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is Mr. Strejček.
Pane předsedající.
Mr. President, Commissioner, I have been listening closely to the debate on credit rating agencies this afternoon. I have to say, I'm not an apologist for rating agencies, nor an advocate thereof. However, I'm not afraid of I'm not in favor of a monopoly or an oligopolistic situation. But I haven't heard anybody ask this afternoon why whole countries have got themselves into an awful fiscal pickle from which they cannot emerge. I think we should have a debate on state intervention in the free market. I think we should talk about where these debts have come from. If we talked about these things, we wouldn't need to spend so much time talking about rating agencies. Thank you.
Senora Comi.
Mrs. Comey has the floor. Thank you, President, Commissioner. I'd like to thank you for having given me this opportunity to speak in this debate, which is taking place just a few days after the enésimo, the X downgrading of Greece by a credit rating agency. If you look at, we need to look at the nature and the governance of these CRAs. These CRAs are practically institutionalized because of the importance they have for our economic system. They dominate the political debate in our countries because of their role in the global economic crisis and because of their role in the crisis in the Eurozone. An economic system like ours cannot function without independent bodies assessing public accounts and the accounts of private companies. But the challenge here is ensuring that these CRAs actually carry out their activities in a transparent fashion with a common standards. If they make a mistake, then that really could bring down a company or even make a contribution to the triggering off of yet another crisis. I don't think we should nationalise the CRAs at all, but what we need to do instead is to strike a balance between their independence and the need to guarantee an appropriate level of accountability to our governments. So we need to find a balanced solution. I think that's the correct approach for a better situation of governance in the EU. Thank you.
And finally, Mr. Papanikolaou.
Commissioner, ladies and gentlemen, yes, yesterday's downgrading of the credit rating of Greece by Moody's raises a number of questions, and this was mentioned by colleagues. In the United States of America, let's try and understand the framework within which these agencies operate, whether it's transparent or correctly operating. Now, most of these agencies, those ratings are not justified on the basis of a law that stipulates that these agencies are not responsible for amounts of money that are lost because of erroneous ratings that they issue. So there's no control or scrutiny. There's no end, there's no boundary to speculation, and we therefore have a situation where all the countries of the European Union are in this adventure. But a free economy doesn't mean the law of the jungle. We have to be aware of the fact that this doesn't mean unbridled action. And to ensure that this is understood, we need to legislate. We need a law. And Commissioner, you said this. We need more agencies working in a fair, competitive market. We're looking forward to hearing proposals from the Commission on this.
Now the floor is yours. You heard some of the questions, arguments, so it's up to you to answer it now. Thank you.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank every speaker for this very high-quality debate. Also, thank you for your frankness. I shan't return now to the role of these agencies and the importance of the ratings they issue, but Mrs. COMI quite rightly recalled us just now about the role of the CRAs in that area. But now, secondly, to pick up the point made by Mr. Papanikolaou and Mr. STREJČEK, we must improve the way in which these agencies work. There needs to be transparency. I'll come back to this. We need objective ratings, but they also need to be beyond doubt. We will achieve that. We have to, but that doesn't mean that that financial institutions will be dispensed of their need to be well managed with proper external scrutiny and also tools to help them survive crises. And that's absolutely, it doesn't dispense the states of having to ensure that that they guarantee proper sound financial system for that and proper governance of their own accounts. Now, when it comes to our regulation on the agencies, we want this regulation to be adopted very quickly so that we can ensure better supervision of these agencies by ESMA. Mrs. Le Pen, well, she's not here anymore, but I did want to correct you, improve your information. It's not the ECB or the Commission that will supervise these agencies. What we wanted, and this is logical, is that it should be the new independent authority, ESMA, that will play this role. There will be more surveillance, more transparency on the market, and as Mr. KLINZ put it quite correctly, there was a need for this transparency. That's clear when you see what's happened over the last few years. And as I said at the beginning of my statement, these proposals and existing legislation, and there's a regulation that has to be properly implemented between now and the end of the year that concerns these CRAs. It exists, and it can only be properly implemented by December 2010. But this regulation doesn't cover all issues. Some questions weren't examined in depth. When it comes to diversification, more competition, Mrs. Swinburne, Mr. SCICLUNA recalled this need for this market of agencies not to be concentrated in too few hands, and then this idea of the issuer who pays the CRAs. Well, Mr. Giegold raises this model, which is a current one. Is it sustainable? Is it acceptable? And Mr. Karas raised this, the issuer also being the payer. And we need to look into this while assessing the rules which exist in the new regulation, the regulation that will enter into force between now and December, because what we have aimed at is a conflict of interest. We want to reduce these in number. Will this regulation be appropriate and sufficient? We'll have to look at that, and also have to look at this model that Mr. Giegold was talking about, of the issuer-payer. And then the third point, national legislation, European legislation. I'd like to know whether legislation isn't based too much on credit ratings from credit rating agencies. Well, I think they are. And finally, Mrs. BＡNSESCU was raising this issue just now. When it comes to the specific methodology for sovereign risks, well, there again we have to work very hard indeed. And I'd like to thank Mr. Sánchez Presedo for the support that he gave to the idea of a rapid agreement on the supervision package, the financial supervision package. And that's the key. We need ESMA, the European Securities and Markets Agency, to carry out this supervision of the CRAs as well. We need a better structure. We'll be looking at all the issues that I've raised, and I'll add to that, we'll be looking at the independence that Chairman Sharon Bowles was calling for ardently. I also hope that there'll be independence and also credibility for these agencies. All players that aren't adequate at the moment, market structures which are not adequate, competition which isn't sufficient. But there's also the idea, which I think is correct, and that is that of creating a European credit rating agency, in particular to deal with the issue of sovereign risk, but not just that, perhaps. I didn't touch upon the status of this agency. Would it be a public agency, a private body, or public-private partnership, or as Mr. KLINZ suggested, well, he had an interesting idea of setting up a foundation. We'll be working on all these matters, and there again, that'll be work we'll be doing over the next few weeks. Various members, Mrs. Bowles, Mr. CHOUNTIS, earlier on Mrs. PODIMATA, just a few minutes ago, raised the recent downgrading of Greek debt. As Commissioner, I can't start commenting in detail on every rating issued by every CRA. That would take too much time. That's not our role. We shouldn't be adding fuel to the fire. We shouldn't be, when it comes to questioning the credibility of these ratings and the rating agencies. That doesn't mean, as my friend Mr. Olli Rehn said this morning to you, it doesn't mean that I wasn't surprised. Mr. MÖLZER was also talking about the surprise at this downgrading. I was surprised by the timing of this most recent rating of Greece by one of the CRAs yesterday. Ladies and gentlemen, we're very aware, and we must say this to public opinion, we're very aware that Greece is making huge efforts. Mr. KLUTE talked about these efforts to return to sound public finances and to restore growth and create a prosperous economy. The Commission is helping Greece as far as it can. These steps are not easy, but they have to be successful. But I'd like to remind you that Greece isn't on its own. There is European solidarity backing Greece up, and we made that clear at the highest level among heads of state and government in the EU and in the IMF a few weeks ago. And this solidarity will continue to be shown. And then when it comes to the different ratings and all the attention paid to them, and then of course the calling into question of the methodology or the timing of these ratings, this all encourages me to carry on with this work of reforming the agencies. We've started this work, as I said, in our 2nd of June communication, and we will be making proposals, legislative proposals, by the end of the year, or the beginning of next year at the latest. And Mr. KLUTE, finally, you said that when we talk about all these matters, we're not just talking about CRAs. Obviously, we have to understand this tool. The tool needs to be improved. We need more transparency, more scrutiny, greater credibility for these agencies, and greater diversification within a global architecture. Will be that which will be subject to intelligent governance and intelligent supervision. These are the lessons we're learning from the crisis, which isn't over yet, and we will be learning all these lessons. It's not just one single player or one single product or one single market or one single member state, that it doesn't require a greater scrutiny, greater supervision. All these things have to be brought together under global supervision structure. And all these proposals from the Commission from the 2nd of June, supported by the ministers' meeting in Luxembourg recently, and I hope, as President Barroso will be hoping soon at the European Council, we can continue this work. And I hope that you will also approve all these measures. We'll be laying the foundation brick by brick of this new architecture. We've entered into all sorts of commitments together. We need to work intelligently as well with other regions of the world. But we're creating a European architecture, and we're learning lessons from the crisis, and we're going to try and make sure those lessons are positive for our consumers and our businesses.
Thank you, Commissioner Barnier. Colleagues, the debate on the item of credit rating agencies is closed. Now we will move over to our next item on the agenda. That's the report by Mr. KLINZ, securities to be offered to the public, and harmonization of transparency requirement. I can see our rapporteur is here, so I give him the floor for 4 minutes.
Herr Präsident!
President, Commissioner, well, if I take more than 4 minutes, then I will speak less at the end of the debate. I won't take more than 6 minutes altogether. When it comes to the Prospectus Directive for securities, well, the legislation was put together in 2003 originally, and then in September 2009 we were supposed to review the prospective legislation. That happened, and the idea was to ensure that we could have the registering and the publication of prospectuses, and that so that we have a better government market in the European Union. The present revision concerns certain technical aspects. The idea is to get rid of legal uncertainty and very high and justifiably high levels of requirements. And I thank, first of all, everyone on the committee and the shadow rapporteurs. We had very good cooperation with the Commission as well. And without that good cooperation, it wouldn't have been possible in less than 10 months to achieve agreement in first reading. When it comes to the agreement that we've adopted, and I'd like to also mention what happened in trialogues. Well, we agreed on the 8 main points. First of all, one goal was that when it came to SMUs, when it came to access to capital, we wanted to make that easier. You know that in America there's a much higher percentage of SMUs getting capital raised on the market, but in Europe SMUs tend to go to banks and saving institutions to raise money. But we want to open up this possibility for SMUs to have greater access to market raised capital. And so when it comes to the threshold for prospectuses, publication of prospectuses, well, obviously that involves a lot of red tape. And so we've gone up from 2.5 million to 5 million as a threshold. The second question is the protection of investors. We want to ensure that when it comes to the lightening of provisions, we don't want the small retail investor to lack protection, adequate protection. And so the threshold for the exemption when it comes to securities it's gone up from to 100,000 per denomination. The second issue is how employees can participate in the share capital of a company without this company without the company then having to expose itself to the expense of publishing a prospectus. So we want to lighten this requirement of publishing a prospectus if we've got employees involved in the shares, and so the disclosure requirements unnecessary disclosure requirements have been deleted, but we have ensured that there should be a basis document, and so the employees who are involved in employee share programs should know exactly what they're receiving through buying these shares. We've also ensured that companies that are listed on stock exchanges on a third country outside the EU should also be liberated from this requirement to publish a prospectus, in the same way as European companies, if they offer shares to their employees, if when it comes to the disclosure levels, they can ensure that they are creating a level playing field and operating on a level playing field. And the fourth area that we've discussed and where we've achieved agreement concerns the so-called summary of the prospectus. What you've got to bear in mind is that a prospectus is often a very, very voluminous document. Sometimes they are hundreds of pages long, and then there is a summary